There is something deeply unsettling about the idea of stepping onto a trail surrounded by pristine wilderness, breathing in the crisp mountain air, listening to the birds singing in the canopy overhead, and then simply ceasing to exist. One moment you are there, walking through sunlight filtering between ancient trees, feeling the solid earth beneath your feet, and the next you are gone. No footprints leading away from your last known position. No sign of a struggle or a fall. No indication of where you went or how you got there. Just gone, as if you had never existed at all. It was a bright April morning in 1952 on a remote cattle ranch near Ritter, Oregon, when 2-year-old Keith Parkins was playing with his older brothers near an old wooden barn. The ranch was owned by Keith's grandfather and sat nestled against the edge of the Umatilla National Forest, a sprawling expanse of wilderness that stretched across the Blue Mountains. The boys had been tossing a ball back and forth in the dusty yard while their mother prepared lunch inside the weathered farmhouse. The air was still cold from the lingering winter, and patches of snow clung to the shadowed hillsides that surrounded the property. Keith's brothers eventually grew hungry and wandered back toward the house, assuming their youngest sibling would toddle along behind them as he always did. But when their mother came to the door to call the children in, Keith was nowhere to be seen. At first, no one panicked. The ranch was isolated but familiar territory, and Keith was a curious child who liked to explore. His mother walked out to the barn, calling his name, her voice carrying across the empty fields. She checked behind the hay bales and inside the small tool shed where the boys sometimes played. Nothing. She walked the perimeter of the property, scanning the tree line where the forest began its climb up the mountainside. Still nothing. By the time Keith's grandfather returned from checking on the cattle, a creeping sense of dread had settled over the family. A child that young could not have wandered far on his own, or so they believed. The grandfather mounted his horse and began riding the trails that led away from the ranch, while others spread out on foot, calling Keith's name until their voices grew hoarse. As afternoon faded into evening, the temperature began to drop rapidly. Weather reports warned of a cold front moving in from the north, bringing with it the possibility of snow and temperatures that would plunge well below freezing overnight. The local sheriff was notified, and within hours a full-scale search operation was underway. Dozens of volunteers from nearby towns converged on the ranch, bringing flashlights and lanterns and dogs trained to track human scent. The search went on through the night, with teams fanning out across the rugged terrain in all directions. The dogs picked up Keith's scent near the barn, but lost it almost immediately, as if the boy had simply been lifted into the air and carried away. The searchers pressed on through the darkness, their lights bobbing like fireflies across the mountainsides while the temperature continued to fall. By morning, snow had begun to dust the higher elevations, and hope was fading fast. A 2-year-old child in light clothing could not possibly survive a night in those conditions. Everyone knew that. And yet they kept searching because the alternative was too terrible to accept. Teams expanded their range, pushing deeper into the wilderness, covering territory that seemed impossible for a toddler to reach. And then, nearly 19 hours after Keith had vanished, a search team found him. He was lying face down on the frozen surface of a small pond, unconscious but somehow alive. His jacket had been removed despite the bitter cold, and his clothes were torn and tattered. He had scratches on his arms and legs, but no serious injuries. The most remarkable detail, however, was where he had been found. The pond was approximately 8 miles from his grandfather's ranch, 8 miles of some of the most rugged and unforgiving terrain in the Pacific Northwest. To reach that spot, Keith would have had to navigate steep ravines and dense forest undergrowth. He would have had to cross multiple creeks swollen with snowmelt, climb over fallen logs taller than he was, and traverse fences meant to keep out cattle. Experienced hikers familiar with the area estimated that even a healthy adult moving at a steady pace would require at least 19 hours to cover that distance in those conditions. The notion that a 2-year-old could accomplish such a journey in the time Keith had been missing seemed physically impossible. When Keith regained consciousness, he offered no explanation for what had happened. He was, after all, barely more than an infant and lacked the language to describe his experience. The only thing he reportedly said was that a cat had scratched him, pointing to the marks on his skin. Years later, survival expert Les Stroud attempted to recreate Keith's journey and found it could not be done in the time frame, not even close. The case of Keith Parkins became one of the earliest documented examples of a phenomenon that would only grow more disturbing with each passing decade. The wilderness that surrounds us, the ancient forests and towering mountains that we set aside as national parks and protected lands, has always harbored mysteries. Indigenous peoples throughout North America have told stories for generations about places where the veil between worlds grows thin, where something lurks just beyond the edge of human perception. These stories were often dismissed as superstition or folklore, but as the 20th century wore on, a pattern began to emerge that defied easy explanation. Children would vanish within seconds of being seen by their parents, only to be found days later in locations miles away, across terrain they could not possibly have crossed. Adults with decades of wilderness experience would walk off established trails and seemingly evaporate into thin air. And when they were eventually found, whether alive or dead, the circumstances of their discovery often raised more questions than they answered. The summer of 1969 was a magical time in America. Humans had just landed on the moon, and the country hummed with optimism and a sense of boundless possibility. For the Martin family of Knoxville, Tennessee, that summer meant continuing a beloved tradition, a Father's Day weekend camping trip to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. William Martin loaded up his 2 sons, 6-year-old Dennis and 9-year-old Douglas, along with his father Clyde, and drove the winding roads into one of the most beautiful and heavily forested regions in the eastern United States. The Great Smoky Mountains straddle the border between Tennessee and North Carolina, encompassing over 500,000 acres of ancient Appalachian wilderness. The park contains some of the oldest mountains on Earth, peaks that have been worn smooth by hundreds of millions of years of wind and rain. Thick forests of oak and hickory and hemlock blanket the slopes, their canopies so dense that the forest floor exists in perpetual twilight. It is a landscape of haunting beauty and hidden dangers, where the terrain can shift from gentle meadow to treacherous ravine in the space of a few steps. The Martins began their trip at Cades Cove, a popular area in the park known for its historic buildings and abundant wildlife. From there, they hiked to Russell Field, where they made camp for the first night. The following day, June 14th, they pushed on to Spence Field, a highland meadow along the Appalachian Trail known for its sweeping views and carpets of wildflowers. There they met another family, the Keys, who were also enjoying the holiday weekend with their children. The boys from both families quickly became friends, as children do. In the late afternoon, with the sun beginning its descent toward the western ridges, the children hatched a plan to play a trick on the adults. They would sneak off into the bushes at the edge of the meadow and then jump out to scare their parents. It was the kind of innocent mischief that defines childhood summers, harmless and gleeful. Douglas Martin and the other boys crept off to the south and west, giggling as they hid behind rhododendron bushes. Dennis, wearing his bright red t-shirt, went the opposite direction, toward the northwest where the Appalachian Trail wound through the trees. William Martin watched his younger son disappear behind a bush, expecting him to pop out at any moment with a triumphant shout. But Dennis never jumped out. 1 minute passed, then 2. The other boys emerged from their hiding spots, laughing and pleased with their prank. But there was no sign of Dennis. William called out his name, assuming the boy was taking the game too seriously. When there was no response, he walked to the spot where he had last seen his son and looked behind the bush. Dennis was not there. What happened next would become the largest search and rescue operation in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. William Martin ran down the trail for nearly 2 miles, calling his son's name until his throat was raw. When he returned without Dennis, the families alerted park rangers, and within hours, a massive search effort was mobilizing. Over the following 2 weeks, more than 1,400 people would scour 56 square miles of rugged mountain terrain, looking for one small boy in a red shirt. The search teams included National Park Service rangers, military personnel, search and rescue volunteers from across the region, and eventually even Green Berets from Fort Bragg. Helicopters swept the valleys while bloodhounds and tracking dogs worked the forest floor. Experienced trackers read the subtle signs of the wilderness, looking for bent twigs or disturbed leaves that might indicate where Dennis had gone. They found nothing. Not a single footprint beyond the immediate area where he had disappeared. Not a thread from his clothing snagged on a branch. Not a trace of the bubble gum he had been chewing, or the candy bar wrappers he might have discarded. The night Dennis vanished, a violent thunderstorm swept across the mountains, dropping 3 inches of rain in a matter of hours and washing away any scent trail the dogs might have followed. Temperatures plummeted into the 50s, and the rain turned trails into rivers of mud. For a small child alone in the dark, the conditions would have been terrifying and potentially deadly. And yet the search teams pressed on, driven by the desperate hope that Dennis had found shelter somewhere and was waiting to be rescued. But perhaps the most disturbing element of the Dennis Martin case emerged not from the official search, but from a family camping several miles away. Harold Key, father of the children the Martins had befriended, was hiking in a different area of the park on the afternoon Dennis disappeared when he and his family heard something that made their blood run cold. It was a scream, Key would later tell investigators, an enormous, sickening scream that echoed off the mountainsides. It was the kind of sound that stopped you in your tracks and made you scan the tree line for predators. Moments after hearing the scream, Key spotted something moving through the underbrush roughly 50 yards away. It appeared to be a man, but not like any man Key had ever seen. The figure was shaggy and unkempt, covered in what looked like rough hair, or perhaps animal pelts. Most disturbingly, the figure appeared to be carrying something over its shoulder, something that Key would later describe as cloth or clothing, and it was red, the same color as the shirt Dennis Martin had been wearing. Key reported his sighting to the authorities, but it was largely dismissed. The location where he claimed to see the shaggy figure was approximately 5 miles from Spence Field, where Dennis had vanished. By trails, the distance was closer to 7 or 9 miles. The FBI and park rangers concluded that even if Key had seen something, it could not have been connected to Dennis Martin, because no human being could have covered that distance in the time between when Dennis disappeared and when Key had his sighting. The terrain was simply too rugged, the distance too great. And yet the question lingered in the minds of those who followed the case. If Dennis Martin did not walk those miles, if his small legs could not have carried him that far that fast, then how might he have gotten there? And what was the figure Harold Key saw moving through the forest with something red draped over its shoulder? The search for Dennis Martin was officially suspended on September 14, 1969, 3 months after his disappearance. His body was never found. His father, William, spent years afterward returning to the mountains, walking the trails and calling his son's name, hoping against hope that somewhere in that vast wilderness, the answers lay hidden. The Dennis Martin case remains one of the most extensively documented and thoroughly investigated disappearances in national park history, and it remains completely unsolved. What makes cases like Dennis Martin and Keith Parkins so deeply unsettling is not merely that children vanished, but the manner in which they did so, and in Keith's case, the impossible circumstances of his discovery. These cases share characteristics that crop up again and again in disappearances across America's wilderness areas. The victim vanishes suddenly and silently, often within sight of companions. Extensive searches yield no trace despite covering terrain that should reveal some evidence of passage. Weather often turns severe shortly after the disappearance, hampering search efforts. And when victims are found, they are frequently in locations that seem physically impossible for them to have reached on their own. 3 decades after Dennis Martin vanished in Tennessee, another small boy would disappear under eerily similar circumstances in the mountains of Colorado. On October 2, 1999, 3-year-old Jaryd Atadero was visiting the Poudre River Resort with his father Alan, 6-year-old sister Josalyn, and members of a Christian singles group to which his father belonged. The resort was owned by Alan and his twin brother and sat near the edge of Roosevelt National Forest, not far from Rocky Mountain National Park. Jaryd was a bright and energetic child with a mop of brown hair and an infectious smile. He had been looking forward to the trip for weeks, excited about the prospect of exploring the mountains with his sister and the other children. That Saturday morning, the group decided to take a short hike to a nearby fish hatchery. Alan initially hesitated to let Jaryd go, but the other adults assured him it would be a gentle, easy walk perfectly suitable for young children. What Alan did not know was that the group had changed their plans. Instead of visiting the hatchery, they decided to hike the Big South Trail, a rugged 11-mile path that climbed through the Comanche Peak wilderness at an elevation of over 8,000 feet. The trail wound through dense forest and crossed rocky terrain that could challenge even experienced hikers. It was not the kind of place you would normally bring a 3-year-old. The group set out around 10 in the morning, with Jaryd immediately racing ahead, as young children often do. He was wearing his favorite green and beige fleece coat over royal blue pants and a pair of white tennis shoes decorated with images of Tarzan. The shoes were untied because Jaryd did not like having his laces done up. At one point during the hike, Jaryd ran about 100 feet ahead of the group and stopped to talk to 2 fishermen on the trail. He reportedly asked them if there were any bears in the woods, a question that struck the men as oddly precocious for such a small child. After speaking with the fishermen, Jaryd continued down the trail ahead of the group. That was the last time anyone saw him. Within minutes of watching him walk around a bend in the trail, the adults realized they could no longer see or hear the boy. They called his name and hurried to catch up, but Jaryd had vanished as completely as if the forest had simply swallowed him whole. What followed was one of the most extensive search and rescue operations in Colorado history. Over 200 people combed the wilderness, including professional search and rescue teams, volunteers, tracking dogs, and helicopter crews. The terrain was punishing, with steep drops and thick undergrowth that made progress slow and dangerous. On the second day of the search, a helicopter carrying rescue personnel crashed along the trail, injuring those on board and adding chaos to an already desperate situation. The sheriff in charge of the search focused publicly on the theory that a mountain lion had attacked Jaryd, pointing out that the cats were known to frequent the area. Behind closed doors, however, he reportedly told Jaryd Atadero that he believed Jaryd had drowned in the river and that it might take up to 5 years for his body to resurface due to the cold water temperatures. Neither explanation satisfied Alan, who spent the following years haunted by questions about what had really happened to his son. Then, on June 4th, 2003, nearly 4 years after Jaryd disappeared, 2 hikers from Fort Collins were exploring an area high above the Big South Trail when they spotted something that stopped them cold. Scattered across a steep, rocky slope approximately 500 feet above the trail were items of children's clothing. There was a pair of white tennis shoes with Tarzan on them. There was a green and beige fleece jacket, torn and tattered. There were royal blue pants, inexplicably turned inside out. The location where these items were found defied explanation. The slope was at a 45-degree angle, covered with loose rocks and scrub vegetation that would make climbing extremely difficult, even for an experienced adult. For a 3-year-old to have reached that spot seemed physically impossible. The search teams that had scoured the area in the days following Jaryd's disappearance had walked directly beneath that slope multiple times. They had looked up at those rocks with binoculars. They had seen nothing. Further investigation of the site yielded additional disturbing discoveries. A skull fragment and a single tooth were found near the clothing. DNA testing confirmed that they belonged to Jaryd. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as undetermined, with a note suggesting a probable mountain lion attack. But the evidence did not fully support that conclusion. Experts on big cats pointed out that a mountain lion would typically attack the abdomen first, seeking the internal organs, yet Jaryd's jacket showed no signs of such an attack. The pants being turned inside out was inconsistent with any animal attack scenario, and the pristine condition of the tennis shoes, which showed minimal weathering despite sitting on that exposed slope for nearly 4 years, raised questions about how long the items had actually been there. Jaryd Atadero has spent the decades since his son's death advocating for changes to search and rescue protocols and working to help other families of missing children. He keeps a shrine to Jaryd in his home that includes the skull fragment recovered from the mountain. When asked about the official explanation for his son's death, Alan shakes his head. The pieces simply do not fit together in any way that makes logical sense. Something happened to Jaryd on that mountain, but whatever it was remains hidden in the shadows of the forest. The patterns that emerge from cases like Keith Parkins, Dennis Martin, and Jaryd Atadero have attracted the attention of researchers and investigators for decades. One of the most prominent is David Paulides, a former police detective who has spent years documenting disappearances in wilderness areas across North America. Paulides has identified clusters of cases that share unusual characteristics, locations where multiple people have vanished under similar circumstances over extended periods of time. The Great Smoky Mountains is one such cluster. The area around Mount Shasta in California is another, and the rugged terrain of Colorado's Front Range has seen its share of inexplicable vanishings as well. 7 years before Jaryd Atadero walked off into the wilderness never to return, another child disappeared from a location not far away. In August 1958, 10-year-old Bobby Bishop was attending Camp St. Malo, a Catholic summer camp located on the southeastern edge of Rocky Mountain National Park, near the small community of Allens Park. Bobby was a happy, outgoing boy with one significant challenge. He had been born almost completely deaf, relying on a hearing aid to participate in the world of sound. Camp St. Malo was overseen by seminarians studying for the priesthood, young men who served as counselors for the children who attended. For Bobby, the camp was an opportunity to spend time in the mountains he loved, fishing in the streams and exploring the trails that wound through the pine forests. The seminarians who ran the camp seemed kind and attentive, and Bobby had made friends among the other campers over the weeks he had been there. His disability did not hold him back from enjoying the activities the camp offered, though it did mean he sometimes missed verbal instructions and had to rely on visual cues and gestures. On the evening of August 15th, Bobby was fishing alone in the cool mountain air, his line cast into a small stream that ran near the camp buildings. The sun was beginning to set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Other campers and counselors were heading back toward the main lodge for dinner, their voices carrying across the meadow. A counselor named Terry Cowan approached Bobby and gestured toward his watch, then pointed at the lodge, motioning for the boy to come inside. Bobby nodded to show he understood, and Cowan walked back toward the building, assuming the boy would follow shortly. But Bobby never came to dinner. When the meal began and his seat remained empty, the counselors assumed he had lost track of time and would come in any moment. It was only when the food grew cold and there was still no sign of the deaf boy that concern began to ripple through the camp. Several counselors went out to the stream where Bobby had been fishing, but he was not there. His fishing pole lay abandoned on the bank, but of Bobby himself, there was no trace. What followed was a search that would involve military personnel, local police, National Park Service rangers, and hundreds of volunteers from across the region. As darkness fell and there was still no sign of the boy, the alarm went out and a massive search operation was launched. Over the following days, military personnel, local police, National Park Service rangers, and hundreds of volunteers scoured the surrounding wilderness. Bloodhounds were brought in to track Bobby's scent. Aircraft flew grid patterns over the mountainsides. An Indian tracker named Benny Bearskin was called in to read the subtle signs of the forest floor. The search lasted 10 days and covered miles of rugged terrain. Bobby was not found. Eventually, the operation was scaled back and then suspended entirely. The boy had seemingly vanished without a trace, another child claimed by the mountains. Then, nearly a year later, in July 1959, a group of counselors and campers from St. Malo were hiking up the east face of Mount Meeker, a 14,000-foot peak that rose directly west of the camp, when one of them spotted something that did not belong. A bone lay exposed on a steep slope approximately 2,000 feet above where Bobby had last been seen. Further investigation revealed more bones and fragments of clothing scattered across the rocky terrain. A hearing aid, broken and weather-beaten, confirmed what everyone feared. Bobby Bishop had been found. The official conclusion was that Bobby had gotten lost in the woods and died from exhaustion and exposure. But the circumstances of his discovery troubled investigators even at the time. The location where his remains were found was in an area that had been searched extensively during the initial operation. teams had walked those slopes with binoculars trained on every rock and crevice. How had they missed the clothing, the bones, the hearing aid? And how had a 10-year-old deaf boy, unable to hear warnings or calls for help, climbed nearly 2,000 feet up one of the most challenging mountains in Colorado without being seen by anyone? Decades later, investigative journalists would uncover even more disturbing details about the Camp St. Malo case. Two of the counselors working at the camp when Bobby disappeared would later be credibly accused of sexually abusing multiple children during their careers as priests. One of them, Neil Hewitt, was among the last people to see Bobby alive and was also the person who discovered his remains on Mount Meeker the following summer. While no direct connection has ever been established between the abuse allegations and Bobby's death, the revelations cast the entire case in a new and troubling light. The National Park Service eventually added Bobby Bizup to its cold case list and launched a new investigation into his disappearance and death. What happened to Bobby Bizup on that August evening in 1958? Did he simply wander off and become lost, as the official explanation suggests? Did something in the camp drive him to flee into the wilderness? Or did something else entirely befall him? Something hidden in the shadows of those ancient mountains that has never been fully understood. The Great Smoky Mountains would claim another victim 12 years after Dennis Martin vanished, this time under circumstances that were somehow even more baffling. On October 8th, 1976, 16-year-old Trenny Lynn Gibson boarded a school bus with approximately 40 of her classmates from Bearden High School in Knoxville, Tennessee. They were headed to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for a horticulture field trip, a day of hiking and studying the plant life of the Appalachian Highlands. Trenny was a pretty girl with light brown hair and green eyes, quiet but well-liked by her peers. She worked part-time at a cafeteria in the local mall, carefully saving her earnings for the future. She lived with her parents and siblings in a comfortable home on Widower Drive, the kind of ordinary American teenager whose disappearance would shatter an entire community. The students arrived at the Clingman's Dome parking area, the highest point accessible by road in the Great Smoky Mountains. From there, they set out on the Forney Ridge Trail toward Andrews Bald, a high-elevation grassy meadow known for its stunning views. The hike was considered moderate, about 3.5 miles round trip on a well-maintained trail. The weather was overcast, but not threatening, and the students spread out along the path in small groups. Trenny hiked alongside a male student named Robert Simpson, who happened to be a friend of her brother. At one point during the hike, Simpson became distracted, tracking a bear he had spotted in the underbrush and separated from Trenny. When the group began their return to the parking area, Trenny was seen walking ahead of her companions, apparently in a hurry to get back to the bus. One of the last people to see Trenny was a fellow student who had stopped to rest. She watched Trenny continue down the trail and then bend down to examine something on the side of the path. The student looked away for just a moment, and when she looked back, Trenny was gone. It was approximately 2:50 in the afternoon. The bus was less than half a mile away. When the students returned to the bus at 3:30, Trenny was not among them. Search efforts began immediately and continued for weeks. Over 150 searchers combed the area, including dog teams that picked up Trenny's scent at various points along the trail. The dogs tracked her scent toward the Appalachian Trail near Clingman's Dome, following it for approximately 1.5 miles before losing it at a road. Other dogs detected her scent on a fallen tree along the Forney Creek Trail. But despite these tantalizing hints, no sign of Trenny herself was ever found. Several details about the case have fueled speculation over the years. A few months before her disappearance, a student named Kelvin Bowman had attempted to break into Trenny's family home. Her mother had shot him in the foot, and he served 6 months in a juvenile detention facility. After his release, Bowman allegedly threatened to kill Trenny. Some students later claimed to have seen a car matching Bowman's following the school bus on the way to the park, though the teacher leading the trip disputed this account. Search dogs detecting Trenny's scent along a road suggested to investigators that she might have left the park in a vehicle. But how? And with whom? The trail where she vanished was busy with hikers that day. Dozens of students were spread out along the path. For someone to have abducted Trenny in broad daylight, in full view of witnesses, without anyone seeing or hearing anything, seemed almost impossible. And yet she was gone. Trenny Lynn Gibson has never been found. Her case remains one of the most troubling unsolved disappearances in Great Smoky Mountains history. A young girl who walked down a familiar trail surrounded by classmates and simply ceased to exist. Her mother continued searching for her for years, never giving up hope that someday the mountains would reveal what they had taken. Not all who vanish in the wilderness are never seen again. Some return under circumstances that defy rational explanation, their experiences during their time missing locked away in gaps of memory that cannot be recovered. The case of Steven Kubacki stands as one of the most bizarre examples of this phenomenon. In February 1978, Steven was a 23-year-old student at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. He was an athletic young man, an idealistic thinker who had grown restless with the confines of academic life. On February 20th, he set out for a solo cross-country skiing trip along the shores of Lake Michigan near the small town of Saugatuck. The ice had formed thick and solid along the shoreline, and Steven planned to spend a day or two exploring the frozen landscape. The next day, snowmobilers discovered Steven's skis and backpack abandoned on the ice. More disturbingly, they found a trail of footprints leading away from the equipment toward the open water of the lake. The prints simply ended at the edge of the ice, as if Steven had walked directly into the freezing water and drowned. Despite extensive searches, no trace of his body was found. His family mourned him as dead, another victim claimed by the treacherous waters of Lake Michigan. 15 months later, on May 5, 1979, Steven Kubacki woke up in a grassy meadow outside Pittsfield, Massachusetts. He was nearly 800 miles from where he had disappeared. He was wearing clothes he did not recognize, carrying a backpack filled with maps and hitchhiking signs he had no memory of acquiring. Inside the bag were items suggesting extensive travel, including a t-shirt from a marathon in Wisconsin and new glasses he did not remember buying. Steven had no memory of the intervening 15 months. His last clear recollection was standing on the ice of Lake Michigan, feeling cold and frightened. Everything between that moment and waking up in Massachusetts was simply gone, erased from his consciousness as completely as if it had never happened. When he walked the 40 miles to his father's home in Pittsfield and rang the doorbell, his father nearly collapsed from shock. His son, whom he had believed dead for over a year, was standing on his doorstep, looking healthy and well-nourished. The Kubacki case attracted intense media attention and sparked speculation ranging from the mundane to the fantastical. Some theorized that Steven had suffered a psychological break and wandered the country in a fugue state. Others pointed to the proximity of his disappearance to the so-called Lake Michigan Triangle, a region that has been associated with unexplained phenomena for decades. Ships and aircraft have vanished in those waters under mysterious circumstances. Witnesses have reported strange lights in the sky and unusual electromagnetic disturbances. Some believe the area contains some kind of natural phenomenon that science has not yet explained. Steven eventually moved to the Pacific Northwest and built a quiet life as a psychologist. For decades, he refused to speak about his experience, leaving the mystery of those 15 months unsolved. In recent years, he published a memoir that offers his own explanation for what happened, an explanation rooted in his disillusionment with society and a desire to escape the expectations placed upon him. But even his own account leaves questions unanswered, gaps in the narrative that suggest the full truth may never be known. The phenomenon of people disappearing in wilderness areas and being found in impossible locations is not limited to remote national parks. It occurs in state forests and county preserves, on private land and public trails. But there is something about our national parks, those vast tracts of protected wilderness, that seems to concentrate these incidents in ways that demand attention. Randy Morganson understood the Sierra Nevada wilderness better than almost anyone alive. He had spent 28 summers as a backcountry ranger in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, patrolling the most remote and inaccessible regions of the High Sierra. He knew every trail and every stream, every hidden lake, and every dangerous crossing. If anyone could navigate that wilderness safely, it was Randy. In July 1996, Randy left his remote duty station near Bench Lake for a routine patrol, leaving a note saying he would be back in 3 or 4 days. He never returned. When fellow rangers realized he was overdue, they launched one of the most emotionally draining search and rescue operations in National Park Service history, because this time they were searching for one of their own. Nearly 100 rescue personnel combed an 80-square-mile radius of some of the most challenging terrain in North America. They searched the canyons and peaks, the snowfields and alpine lakes. They called Randy's name across valleys where the echoes carried for miles. They found nothing. After 7 days, the search was suspended. One of the most experienced wilderness rangers in the country had simply disappeared. 5 years later, in July 2001, a trail worker stumbled upon bones along a creek in the Window Peak drainage. Near the bones was a tattered shirt with a ranger's badge still attached. A backpack lay nearby with its waist belt still buckled, suggesting it had never been removed from the body. And resting on a rock above a waterfall was a park-issued radio still switched on. The official conclusion was that Randy had fallen through a snow bridge and broken his leg, dying of hypothermia and associated injuries. His body had been washed downstream and hidden in the rocks, which explained why the initial search had failed to find him. But questions lingered. The location where his remains were discovered had been searched multiple times during the rescue operation. How had experienced rangers, people who knew Randy and the terrain better than almost anyone, missed finding him? Randy Morganson's story illustrates a recurring theme in wilderness disappearances, the discovery of remains in locations that had been thoroughly searched before. It happens often enough that it cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence or searcher error. Bodies and belongings appear in places where hundreds of trained eyes have already looked. Items of clothing turn up in pristine condition after years of exposure to the elements. The wilderness, it seems, releases what it takes only when it chooses to. The case of Thelma Pauline Melton offers yet another variation on this disturbing theme. On September 25, 1981, the 58-year-old woman everyone called Polly was hiking the Deep Creek Trail in the Great Smoky Mountains with two longtime friends. She had walked this trail countless times over nearly 20 years, knew every turn and every view. It was, by any measure, an easy and familiar route. On the return leg of their hike, Polly suddenly quickened her pace, walking ahead of her companions with unusual energy. One of her friends called out, joking that she would not want to be in a foot race with Polly. Polly turned back, laughed, and kept walking. She crested a small hill on the trail and disappeared from view. When her friends came over the rise moments later, expecting to see Polly resting on one of the benches that lined the path, she was nowhere to be found. The search for Polly Melton involved over 150 personnel and 9 K9 teams covering approximately 100 miles of trails and forest. The dogs picked up her scent at various points, but could not establish a clear trail. One dog detected her scent on a fallen tree, as if she had sat down to rest. Another tracked her toward a road where the scent simply ended. Park officials eventually concluded that Polly had left the park in a vehicle, probably of her own free will. If she had been anywhere in the park, they reasoned, the dogs would have found her. But this explanation raised as many questions as it answered. Who was driving the vehicle? Where did she go? And why would a woman who had spent her afternoon preparing dinner for her husband suddenly decide to abandon her life? Polly Melton has never been found. Her husband Robert continued to wait for her at their Airstream trailer for years, refusing to believe she had voluntarily left him. The mystery of her disappearance has never been solved. These stories represent just a fraction of the documented cases of people vanishing in America's wilderness areas under mysterious circumstances. The National Park Service does not maintain a comprehensive database of missing persons in parks, making it difficult to assess the true scope of the phenomenon. Researchers like David Paulides have identified hundreds of cases that share the unusual characteristics we have explored: sudden disappearances, impossible recovery locations, clothing found in inexplicable conditions, and victims found in places that defy physical explanation. What is happening in our wilderness areas? Are these cases simply the result of accidents and misadventures, the inevitable tragedies that occur when millions of people venture into wild and dangerous places? Or is there something else at work, some phenomenon that operates at the edges of our understanding? The wilderness does not give up its secrets easily. It keeps them buried in the deep forests and hidden canyons, locked away in the hearts of mountains that have stood for hundreds of millions of years. Those who venture into these places do so at their own risk, stepping across an invisible threshold into a world where the rules we think we understand may not apply. The families of the missing continue to search and hope and remember. They walk the trails where their loved ones were last seen, calling out names that echo unanswered through the trees. They study maps and reports and old photographs, looking for the clue that everyone else might have missed. They refuse to let the wilderness have the final word. And somewhere out there, in the shadows beneath the ancient canopy, in the hollows between mountains that have witnessed the rise and fall of species beyond counting, the answers wait. Perhaps they will never be found. Perhaps they were never meant to be. But the search continues because in the end, it is all that those left behind can do. The stories we have examined tonight share common threads that weave through the fabric of wilderness disappearances across North America. There is the suddenness of the vanishing, the way victims seem to simply wink out of existence in the space of a heartbeat. There is the vastness of the searches that follow, the hundreds of trained personnel who comb terrain inch by inch only to find nothing. there is the discovery, sometimes years later, of remains in locations that seem to mock the very concept of physical possibility. And underlying it all, there is the gnawing suspicion that something is happening in these wild places that we do not understand and perhaps cannot understand. The patterns repeat with disturbing consistency. Children too young to walk more than a few hundred yards are found miles away, across terrain that would challenge an experienced adult. Bodies appear in locations that were searched multiple times, as if they had not been there before. Clothing is discovered in pristine condition after years of exposure to the elements, or turned inside out in ways that make no logical sense. Tracking dogs lose scent trails abruptly, as if the person they were following had simply been lifted into the air and carried away. Researchers have noted the geographic clustering of these cases. Certain areas seem to be hotspots for unexplained vanishings, places where multiple people have disappeared under similar circumstances over extended periods of time. The Great Smoky Mountains is one such cluster. The wilderness areas surrounding Boulder, Colorado, represent another. The forests of the Pacific Northwest, the mountains of Montana and Wyoming, the deserts of the American Southwest have all seen their share of disappearances that defy easy explanation. Some have speculated about natural phenomena that might account for these cases. There are areas of unusual geological activity, places where magnetic fields fluctuate in ways that could theoretically affect navigation and perception. There are regions of extreme weather variability, where conditions can shift from clement to deadly in the space of an hour. There are ecosystems that harbor predators capable of taking down a human being and leaving little trace. Any of these factors might explain individual cases, but none of them fully account for the pattern as a whole. Others have proposed more exotic explanations. There are those who believe that something unknown to science dwells in these wilderness areas, some intelligence or entity that takes people for reasons we cannot fathom. The indigenous peoples of North America have told stories for generations about creatures that inhabit the deep forests, beings that were here long before humans arrived and that regard intruders with hostility or hunger. These stories vary in their details, but share a common warning that certain places in the wilderness are not meant for human beings, that those who venture too deep into the wild may encounter something that does not want them there. The official response to wilderness disappearances has historically been fragmented and inconsistent. The National Park Service, which oversees more than 400 sites encompassing over 85 million acres, does not maintain a centralized database of missing persons. Cases are handled at the individual park level, with information often siloed and difficult to access. Researchers seeking to understand the scope of the phenomenon have had to piece together data from dozens of different sources, filing Freedom of Information Act requests, and scouring old newspaper archives for mentions of cases that were never formally reported. This lack of systematic record-keeping has fueled suspicions among some researchers that authorities are deliberately obscuring the true extent of wilderness disappearances. Why, they ask, would an agency tasked with managing lands visited by hundreds of millions of people each year not keep track of how many of those visitors go missing? The National Park Service has responded that missing persons cases are typically handled by local law enforcement agencies with jurisdiction over the land in question, making centralized tracking logistically challenging. Critics counter that the technology exists to create such a database, and that the failure to do so suggests either incompetence or intentional obfuscation. Whatever the reasons for the gaps in official record keeping, the stories themselves continue to accumulate, Every year brings new cases of people who ventured into the wilderness and never returned, or who returned under circumstances that raised more questions than they answered. The families of the missing are left to navigate a bureaucratic maze while simultaneously coping with grief and uncertainty, never knowing whether their loved ones are alive or dead, at peace or suffering. The psychological toll on these families is immense. Unlike cases where a body is recovered and a cause of death established, wilderness disappearances often leave survivors in a state of perpetual limbo. They cannot grieve properly because they cannot be certain their loved one is gone. They cannot move forward because they cannot stop wondering what really happened. They become trapped in a cycle of hope and despair, scanning every crowd for a familiar face, answering the phone with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Some families have channeled their grief into advocacy, working to improve search and rescue protocols and raise awareness about wilderness safety. Jaryd Atadero, whose son Jaryd vanished on the Big South Trail in 1999, became a prominent voice in the push for improved coordination between agencies during search operations. He testified before state legislators and worked to establish clearer guidelines for when and how to deploy resources in missing child cases. The Colorado Amber Alert System, now credited with helping to recover numerous abducted children, was enacted in part due to his efforts. Other families have pursued private investigations, hiring detectives and forensic specialists to examine evidence that official channels deemed inconclusive. They have organized volunteer search parties years after official operations were suspended, returning to the last known locations of their loved ones with fresh eyes and advanced equipment. Some have found answers this way, discovering remains that professional search teams had somehow missed. Others have come back empty-handed, their questions still unanswered. The technology available for wilderness search and rescue has advanced considerably in recent decades. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging can detect the heat signature of a human body, even through forest canopy. Drones can survey terrain that would take ground teams days to cover. Satellite imagery can reveal changes in vegetation patterns that might indicate where someone passed through. Search dogs have been bred and trained to ever higher standards of performance, able to track scent trails that would have been undetectable to previous generations. And yet people continue to disappear. The wilderness continues to claim its victims, swallowing them without trace or explanation. For all our technological sophistication, for all our mapping and tracking and remote sensing, there remain vast stretches of wild land where human beings are simply out of their element. Where the rules we have built our civilization upon give way to older and stranger forces. Where things happen that we cannot explain and perhaps are not meant to explain. The appeal of the wilderness is ancient and primal. It calls to something deep within us, a memory of the days when our ancestors roamed free across the land, before the walls of civilization closed in around us. We are drawn to the wild places because they offer something that our domesticated lives cannot provide. A sense of freedom and possibility, a connection to the natural world that has been our home for millions of years. But that freedom comes with risks that we sometimes fail to appreciate until it is too late. The wilderness is beautiful, but it is not safe. It is magnificent, but it is not merciful. It is home to wonders beyond counting and dangers beyond measure. Those who venture into it must do so with respect and caution, understanding that they are guests in a house that does not always welcome visitors. For the families of the missing, the wilderness represents something more complex still. It is the last place their loved ones were seen alive, the setting of their final moments. It is the scene of their desperate searches, the backdrop to their worst nightmares. And it is the keeper of secrets that may never be revealed, holding its mysteries close beneath the canopy of ancient trees and the shadows of ageless mountains. The cases we have explored tonight represent only a small sampling of the documented disappearances in America's wilderness areas. There are hundreds more, each with its own details and circumstances, its own grieving family and unanswered questions. They span more than a century of recorded history, from the early days of the national park system to the present day. They involve people of all ages and backgrounds, experienced outdoorsmen and casual day hikers, children and senior citizens. They occur in every region of the country, in every type of terrain, in every season of the year. What links them all is the sense of wrongness, the feeling that what happened cannot be fully explained by the natural processes we think we understand. A child found miles away across impossible terrain. A veteran ranger vanishing from trails he had walked 1,000 times. A body appearing in a location that was searched exhaustively before. These are not mere accidents or misadventures. They are anomalies, data points that do not fit the expected pattern, mysteries that persist despite our best efforts to solve them. The wilderness keeps its secrets well. It has been keeping them for longer than human beings have walked the earth. But as long as there are families waiting for answers, as long as there are researchers asking questions, as long as there are those who refuse to accept that some things cannot be explained, the search will continue. Because in the end, that is what it means to be human. We seek understanding. We demand answers. We refuse to let the darkness have the final word. If you found this journey into the mysteries of America's wilderness areas compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories that probe the edges of the unknown, the unexplained events that lurk in the spaces between what we think we understand and what remains forever mysterious. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. And if you have your own experience to share, a moment when the wilderness revealed something that defied explanation, we would love to hear from you in the comments below. These stories matter because they remind us that there are still frontiers to explore, still mysteries to solve, still questions that demand answers. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and perhaps think twice before you step off the marked trail into the shadows of the ancient forest. The wilderness is waiting, and it keeps its secrets well.